What if I told you that the man who brought us so much was also instrumental in creating a killing machine? Thomas Edison's name is synonymous with progress, yet there's a paradox untold in textbooks. To eliminate his chief rival, Nikola Tesla, Edison launched the dirtiest PR campaign in the history of science. This campaign ultimately led to the invention of the electric chair. Now, you'll discover why this genius resorted to such monstrous acts. At the heart of the conflict was the war of currents. Edison's direct current DC was safe, but could only be transmitted over short distances. Tesla and Westinghouse's alternating current AC was efficient, inexpensive, and could travel for hundreds of miles. At stake was the contract to electrify all of America, billions of dollars and control over the future. This wasn't a scientific debate, it was a war of annihilation. Imagine it this way: Edison's DC was like a powerful but short garden hose, great for 1 yard but useless for watering the next street. Tesla's AC was a high-pressure system capable of delivering water for miles with minimal loss. Edison sold hoses, while Tesla proposed building a nationwide plumbing system. On one side stood Edison, the wizard of Menlo Park. A brilliant marketer and ruthless businessman who built an empire. He held over 1,000 patents and believed in his motto: 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. He was a pragmatist. On the other was Tesla, an eccentric visionary who thought on a planetary scale but lacked business acumen. He possessed a photographic memory and claimed he could visualize inventions in his mind down to the smallest detail. He was a pure genius, untouched by corporate intrigue. Their collision was inevitable. But this war wasn't fought in laboratories or courtrooms. It was waged on the streets, using stray dogs, and ultimately ended with a man strapped to a chair. How did we get there? It all began with an unusual request the U.S. government sent to the only man it trusted. The request came from a specially formed New York State Commission on the most humane and practical methods of executing death sentences. The name itself sounds like a cruel irony. Imagine, for a moment, you are Edison. Your entire empire, everything you've built, is threatened by an upstart rival. How far would you go to protect your enterprise? Remember your answer. We'll revisit it at the end. In the late 19th century, America was searching for a new method of execution. Hanging, the primary method at the time, was cruel and unpredictable. In 1881, the execution of Roxana Drew became a nightmare when the rope failed to break her neck and she slowly suffocated for 15 minutes. Such incidents provoked public outrage. The country needed a method that reflected the spirit of progress, humane, scientific, and swift. Then, a dentist named Alfred Southwick entered the scene. In that same year, 1881, in Buffalo, New York, he witnessed a drunkard accidentally touch generator contacts and die instantly. An idea sparked in Southwick's mind. Use electricity for executions. The concept consumed him. He began experimenting on stray animals and spent years sending letters to politicians, lobbying for his method. He even developed the first prototype, which resembled a dental chair more than an instrument of death. He was heard. The New York State government created that very commission to find humane methods. Their primary question was technical: which current to use, DC or AC? They decided to seek an answer from the leading authority on electricity. They wrote a letter to the man who had lit their city, Thomas Edison. Edison was publicly against capital punishment and initially refused. But then, he saw a brilliant diabolical opportunity in the request. He replied, "My direct current is too safe. For killing, use the lethally dangerous alternating current of my competitor, George Westinghouse." Imagine the government asking Coca-Cola which beverage would be best to create a poison, and Coca-Cola replies, "Our drink is too good. Use Pepsi. It's perfect." Edison had just handed his enemy a poisoned gift, intending to forever associate Westinghouse's name with death. Irony scale, 10 out of 10. The man who brought light to the streets of New York had just advised on the best way to kill on those very streets. But this was only the beginning of his plan. Edison understood he couldn't dirty his own hands. His plan required a public face, an executor, and he found him, an engineer named Harold Brown, his personal attack dog. Their task was simple and brutal: proved to the world that alternating current was the current for killers. Edison secretly funded everything out of his own pocket. Archives contain letters where he meticulously instructed Brown on how best to conduct the demonstrations, concluding with a clear request, "Do not mention my name." Edison was the director of this bloody theater, always remaining behind the scenes. Brown immediately set to work. He opened a laboratory at Columbia College and began buying stray dogs and cats from local boys for 25 cents apiece. This wasn't pure science. It was cold, calculated preparation for a public spectacle. In just a few weeks, Brown and his assistant, Dr. Fred Peterson, electrocuted over 24 dogs. Their laboratory journal read more like a casualty list than a scientific document, meticulously recording the voltage required to end life. On July 30th, 1888, the show began. In a stuffy hall packed with reporters, the air was thick with anticipation. Brown brought out a large black and white dog weighing 77 pounds. He calmly connected the electrodes. A flick of the switch, and the animal collapsed dead. The journalists were horrified, but the next day's headlines screamed exactly what Edison wanted. The New York Times reported that the dog's death was instantaneous and painless. Cruelty had just been successfully masked as a scientific breakthrough, and the press became an unwitting accomplice. George Westinghouse was furious. He was a businessman, but he had principles. He publicly refused to sell his AC generators for prisons, stating they'd be better off using an axe. He understood that Edison wasn't just trying to win a business dispute, but to forever brand his name with death. Westinghouse struck back, spending over $100,000, a colossal sum for the time, on the best lawyers. Their goal, to prove in court that electrocution was cruel and unusual punishment. He sought to save not only his company's reputation, but also the life of the first man sentenced to death by the chair. Now, let's look at this through the eyes of a reporter in that hall. He came to witness a marvel of science, but instead became a witness to cold-blooded killing. His article wasn't just news, it was a weapon Edison loaded and handed him, and it hit its mark precisely. But the Edison and Brown team went even further. They needed fear to become personal. They coined a new verb, to be Westinghoused, meaning to be killed by alternating current. This was a brilliant and monstrous marketing ploy, not just a mere colloquialism. The term was deliberately promoted in pamphlets, secretly funded by Edison, one of the first examples of viral, black marketing in history. They had their weapon, and they had given it a terrifying name. Now, they needed larger victims. Dogs and cats weren't enough. For the horror to become palpable, Brown, spurred on by Edison, moved on to calves and horses. These public executions drew crowds. One of the most illustrative demonstrations took place in December 1888 at Edison's personal laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey. The Wizard of Menlo Park personally watched as alternating current killed a horse. This no longer resembled science. It was a sacrifice on the altar of PR. Their method was a deception disguised as an experiment. First, they'd pass 1,000 volts of Edison's direct current through an animal. The animal would convulse, cry out in pain, but remain alive. Then, they'd take the same 1,000 volts, but of Westinghouse's alternating current, a flick of the switch, and instantaneous death. To the crowd, this was irrefutable proof. It was a magician's trick, showing two pistols, firing blanks from the first at an assistant who remains unharmed, then firing a live round from the second, and the assistant drops dead. The conclusion for the audience is obvious. The second pistol is the killer. Edison and Brown were such magicians, only their deception was lethally real. The culmination of this cruelty was a story that unfolded slightly later, in 1903. It involved a circus elephant named Topsy. At Luna Park on Coney Island, before 1,500 spectators, she was led to electrodes. Just in case, she was fed carrots laced with 460 grams of potassium cyanide. Then, 6,600 volts of alternating current were passed through her enormous body. The giant collapsed, raising a cloud of dust. Edison filmed this. His movie, titled Electrocuting an Elephant, became one of the first viral videos in history. It was shown in kinetoscopes nationwide as a vivid advertisement of the mortal danger of alternating current. The end, perhaps, justified the means for Edison. He likely genuinely believed he was saving the world from a dangerous technology. But did this belief entitle him to such public cruelty? The line between genius and monster became increasingly thin. Westinghouse tried to stop this madness. His lawyers took the case in re Kemmler all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that electrocution was cruel and unusual punishment that violated the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. They lost. The court rejected the appeal, ruling that the state had the right to choose the method. This set a precedent for decades to come. Edison had won. The world's first electric chair would operate on Westinghouse's alternating current. Now they had everything: legal authorization, public opinion shaped by fear, and a killing machine. All that was missing was a man. His name was William Kemmler, a vegetable peddler who, in a drunken rage, hacked his wife to death with an axe. He was an illiterate son of German immigrants, an alcoholic, a perfect defenseless pawn in the game of industrial giants whose existence he likely didn't even suspect. The machine, born of corporate warfare and tested on animals, was ready. All that remained was to find a man to pull the switch. That man was Edwin Davis, New York State's first state electrician. On August 6, 1890, he stood in a small room at Auburn Prison. Before him were 17 witnesses, doctors and reporters, pale with anticipation, and the chair itself. Davis's oak design looked terrifyingly mundane, like a piece of furniture, which only amplified the surrealism. William Kemmler entered the room calmly. On his head was a metal helmet resembling an inverted bucket. He looked at the witnesses and said, "Gentlemen, I wish you good luck. I'm sure I will go to a good place." Davis pulled the switch. 1,000 volts of alternating current surged through Kemmler's body for 17 seconds. His body stiffened, pressed against the straps. Doctors approached, checked his pulse. Death was pronounced. It seemed everything had gone according to plan. But then one of the witnesses screamed in horror. It's crucial to understand. The 1,000-volt setting had been chosen almost at random. No one knew the precise voltage required to kill a human. This wasn't an execution. It was a horrifying real-time experiment based on data obtained from killing horses. Kemmler began to breathe, softly at first, then louder. Foam appeared at his mouth and his body began to convulse. A thick smell of burning flesh and singed hair hung in the room. Panic. The humane execution had turned into torture before its creator's eyes. One witness, Dr. George Schrady, later wrote, "The condemned man was literally roasted to death." In haste, Davis rushed back to the switch. He cranked the voltage up to 2,000 volts, but the generator needed time to recharge. During those agonizing seconds, which stretched into almost 2 minutes, Kemmler was alive and burning. The second jolt literally incinerated him. Blood vessels under his skin began to burst. The entire procedure, from the first jolt to the final pronouncement of death, took about 8 minutes. 8 minutes of pure hell, advertised as a humane alternative. One reporter would write, "It was an awful spectacle, far worse than hanging." News of the failed execution spread worldwide. Edison's PR victory had turned into his greatest disaster. His attempt to prove the deadliness of alternating current had led to the creation of a monstrous torture machine. George Westinghouse, upon hearing what happened, uttered his famous line, "They'd have done better with an axe." But Edison refused to admit defeat. He told the press that the executioners simply hadn't used high enough AC voltage. Even after this catastrophe, he continued his war, shifting the blame to the executioners. For him, it wasn't a tragedy. It was merely a botched demonstration. But all this dirty campaigning couldn't change the laws of physics. Alternating current was objectively better, cheaper, and more efficient. And in 1893, this became clear to the entire world. Westinghouse's company won the era's most significant contract, the construction of an unprecedented power plant at Niagara Falls. This wasn't just business, it was a technological knockout. Tesla's engineers managed to harness the raw fury of nature, transforming the power of falling water into clean energy and sending it to power cities hundreds of miles away. The war of currents was over. A few years later, the unthinkable happened. Edison's own company, General Electric, to survive in a market it no longer controlled, was forced to fully adopt alternating current technology. It would be like Blockbuster, after years of fighting Netflix, being forced to close all its stores and launch its own streaming service, using the very technology they had so long denied. It was a quiet, humiliating, but absolute admission of defeat. Edison lost the technological battle, but his most monstrous creation, born of revenge and corporate greed, the electric chair, remained. Ineffective and cruel, it became the primary symbol of capital punishment in America for a century. Over 4,400 people were executed in that oak chair throughout the 20th century. The dark legacy of Edison's PR campaign proved incredibly resilient. Edison lost the war, but went down in history as the greatest inventor. Tesla won the war, but died in poverty and obscurity. Sometimes, victory looks exactly like this. This story leaves us with 3 harsh lessons. First, the end does not justify the means. Edison's obsession with victory pushed him past the line where genius transforms into a monster. The cost of this victory proved higher than the victory itself. Second, reputation is more important than profit. Edison forever stained his name with the electric chair. Westinghouse, despite losing money, fought for the integrity of his name and in the long run won. And third, the most important, the best technology always wins. No PR campaign, no matter how dirty, could stop the laws of physics. So how did the genius who gave the world light end up creating a killing machine? The answer is simple: fear. Fear of losing his empire, fear of being proven wrong. And this fear has a scientific name: loss aversion, a concept by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. For Edison, the psychological pain of losing his DC empire was twice as strong as the joy of potentially winning with new technology. This cognitive bias forced the genius to act irrationally and cruelly. And now, the main question for you. In this story, was Thomas Edison a brilliant strategist who went too far? Or was he simply a villain, intoxicated by power? In the comments, write just one word that you believe describes him: strategist or villain.